Welcome to the Moments podcast, where moms get honest conversations, support, and a community to help you thrive at work and at home. Working mothers are literally existing in two completely different calendars at once, the corporate calendar and the school calendar, and they don't overlap. I asked on the Moments WhatsApp channel if moms could ask HR anything anonymously, and by the amount of responses I received within an hour, I knew I struck a nerve and that there's clearly a gap between policy and reality. So today, we're not asking how moms can cope better. We're asking if and how these two systems can better coexist. It's an honest conversation about whether the rules serve the people and if our two worlds can become one. I'm joined by Silke Rathbone, an HR specialist who sits on the inside of these systems. As a mom of two, she completely understands the tension between company policy and the reality. Welcome, Silke.
Hi, Madge. Lovely to be here.
I want to start our conversation on a positive note because some of the topics feels quite heavy. So from an outsider perspective, especially post-COVID, it looks like a lot of companies do understand the juggle struggle and they have more sympathy and they offer more flexibility. Is this what you're also experiencing with your clients?
Yeah, I definitely think post-COVID, there was a shift in a lot of companies realizing that, employees could actually work productively from home, which was incredible to see. I think before COVID, it was completely different. Um, I think a lot of companies are, and it's actually in the past year, I would say, are really striving to become employers of choice. One of the aspects, in order to be an employer of choice, is also creating a flexible working environment and much more focus on on measuring performance and output than clock watching, if I can put it that way. Obviously, there are some companies who have no interest in doing that, but I would say there's definitely been a shift.
That's so good to hear. And I think although the change was quite rapid during COVID and even after that, it slowed down a bit. And I think the important thing is to still notice that there are companies who definitely strive to be more accommodating.
Yeah.
So now the question is, on paper, some
Mm-hmm.
companies might be very accommodating and they allow all these things. But when it comes to actually leaving early for a sports match or a school play or whatever the case may be,
Yeah.
how some parents still feel guilty or they do get the instruction to make up the hours. How
Mm.
does HR help build this culture of trust?
So I'm I always say culture is not what you have on paper. Culture is something that a staff or employee feels, right? So it's a feeling of this is actually a working environment that is safe. Um, but together with that, I'm a huge fan of having really strong policies and processes in place. And also um using technology and HR platforms. And why I'm saying that is, for instance, if you are measuring output and performance via, let's say, HR platform, it shouldn't matter to you whether the employee is going to fetch their dog or watching a play. Like, it shouldn't be, oh, we are amazing for allowing you to do this, right? It should be your weekly target or output is the following. So whether you're doing it by 2 o'clock and you go to the play and you finish it later on. Obviously, except if there's like a deadline or something, by a specific time. But I think it's about the lens and creating a framework wherein staff feel safe to do that, and that it isn't later on like, hey, you should have worked this. It should be like, did you complete what you were supposed to complete? Yeah.
Yes, I get you.
Yeah.
It I feel like trust is such an important thing here because the company trusts that you have their interests at heart, but so does the employee. So you just spoke about HR tools. How does a organization measure commitment and performance beyond time spent in front of a laptop?
So a lot of where I have gotten a clock, a company that I would say is clock watching to actually move to output based is if they have the right policies in place and processes, and if they are able to make decisions based on data. So platforms like HiBob, Zoho People, you're measuring the staff members' output and deliverables, and not whether the staff member was there for 8 hours. And I think that's the key, because only once HR internally is able to sit with, let's say, the CEO and say, hey, Madge, this is Madge, like pull that data of Madge's performance, then the CEO is most likely not going to care whether Madge was there 5 or 8 hours if Madge is performing. But what often happens is that the companies don't have those tools in place. They still old school in the sense of they go on a feeling and hours. But I feel like sometimes once they've tried that and they have the right tools in place, they often are like, wow, this is incredible to be able to, actually measure performance and not just whether Madge was in the office. Yeah.
But many organizations claim to be flexible, but then it so often boils down to a specific manager or someone in charge. How are these managers held accountable when flexibility exists in policy, but it's not supported in practice?
So I think, once again, a lot of the companies who have the privilege mentality haven't actually tried it. Okay. Or they tried it, but they didn't have the right processes or tools, meaning HR, like a platform to back the trial. So they
Okay.
just feel like they've lost control, and then they revoke the privilege, but they didn't do the whole process correctly. I think where managers often make different decisions is if there's actually not a standardized approach. So with flexibility, it should be, staff should feel the policy is fair. Everyone knows what the framework is. Then I think managers feel more comfortable making that decision. I think you get that unfairness when the basics haven't been put into place. You can actually track with the system to see how many times flexibility, for instance, has declined. And you can say, okay, well, Silke, why have you declined, Madge's flexibility for all these occasions? But I also think it often happens when managers actually don't buy into the bigger vision of it. So I think it starts off with a company saying, listen, we've got 5 KPIs for our year, for example. One is being an employer of choice, right? So in order to do that, you need to make sure that, yourself and your team, that policies are consistently applied. So I think but you need to be able to know what the managers are doing, because very often I think HR, the internal HR, actually doesn't know that's happening.
So it all boils down to good communication, data and just being consistent.
Consistent, and managers, some companies just literally, hey, here's our flexibility policy, but the managers actually don't get the right training, or it's never workshopped, or a system is implemented, and staff, even managers, are sometimes too scared to say, hey, I actually don't know how this thing works. So it's about, when you do something, and let's say it's flexibility, do it properly, from policy to workshop to implement to system. Test where something goes wrong, get feedback, do surveys, ask managers, I see you've declined twice. Why? But I think it's very difficult for HR to pick up those things if there's no system or policy supporting it as a framework. Yeah.
So one of the moms asked if HR is there to protect the company or the people, which I thought was quite an interesting question. And I believe the answer is both.
Yeah.
But does HR actively track burnout and emotional labor for working parents, or can organizations intervene earlier before burnout actually ends up in resignation?
So I think I always say, being in HR is like a calling, because you really need to be a very fair, consistent, and constantly have two hats on. So, and I think, so the short answer, both, because you should be saying, okay, is what the company is proposing fair? Is it being consistently applied? And if it isn't, being able to say, the employee is correct in this scenario, and rectifying it. So I think it should be both. I know it isn't always. I think some staff members think HR is appointed by the company and they simply do what the company wants them to do. In that scenario, you don't have a good culture, because that HR should feel comfortable enough to say to the CEO, what we're doing isn't right, or this isn't fair. Yeah. Then, in terms of burnout, I think the honest answer is no. I don't think a lot of HRs are tracking it. I think at this point it's very reactive instead of proactive. I think there has been a much bigger drive towards wellness in the past year or two, especially post COVID. But for me, I think burnout, having wellness programs, those type of stuff is obviously great, right? But for me, burnout happens when someone feels like their balance isn't right in their life. So for me, that links back to our first point in terms of hybrid working models, flexibility. And that's part of burnout. That's why a lot of people end up resigning, because they feel like they're not spending enough time with their child, or they're actually not exercising, which impacts mental health. So using that time you would have sat in traffic to actually exercise or fetch your child. And I think in that way, you are ensuring that staff don't feel like, staff don't feel like they have to choose, because that's what happens is a mom or dad ends up being like, listen, I just can't leave 7:00 in the morning, come back at 7. Like, I've only had 6 actually productive hours in the office. Such a waste of time. Where if you're able to bring in hybrid and flexibility, I feel like your burnout will be less, because people feel like they have balance.
Yeah. You said something interesting, and it's like that happens when you have to choose, which is more or less what I tried to say at the beginning about the two worlds, and we're trying to have them coexist. And that brings me to my question about the two calendars. And the one is, the corporate world runs on a 12-month cycle, but the school calendar doesn't. Is it possible for companies to bridge this gap without mothers and fathers having to sacrifice all their annual leave just to cover school holidays?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one because on the one side, once again, putting on both hats, you know, company perspective often is, listen, it's your leave, you decide when you want to use it, right? Um, HR perspective would often be, yeah, what is leave there for? Leave is there to actually rest and to come back more productive.
Mm.
So what ends up happening is, like, if let's say a working mom uses that leave during school holiday, she's just exhausted.
Yeah.
Let's be honest, it's very hard work. It's not
Yeah.
leave.
No. No.
um, so I think a middle ground, once again, if the type of role allows it, would be to say, listen, and you're gonna hear me hammer about like HR platforms, but it's really the future. I think um, a good HR needs to have that data at their fingertips, and with that is, for instance, in saying, okay, Madge, let's plan, and a strong manager is saying, let's plan out the year, and looking more, I would say, um, and not seeing school holidays as having to take leave, but let's do like workforce planning, or let's plan out the projects in a way that in that period you still have deliverables, but it's more doable in that period. You just a bit more of better planning, and obviously there's always last minute projects or stuff that does come up, but I do think very often it's just that there isn't planning of those
Hmm.
periods.
Yeah,
Um,
I think many people also feel like they can't ask for more because of the guilt. They feel like asking for more annual leave days or asking for more flexibility during those periods where the kids don't go to school. It's it's very hard to communicate, but if HR actually supports it and encourages it, that would make such a big difference.
yeah, and I think that's why I'm a huge fan of hybrid and flexibility, because it shouldn't only be whether it's school holiday. It should be your child is sick.
So I got many questions about children being sick and
Yeah.
not having a backup plan. And so many companies do still require that parents take annual leave when their kids are sick. And sometimes, especially I found when my kids were much smaller and still in creche,
Mhm.
the the 15 annual leave days I had
Mhm.
certainly didn't cover the sick days, and then meant no holiday at all for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
So, how realistic is this policy, given that most working moms, like I said, don't have a backup plan, and they sometimes even send the kids back to school while they're still sick just to protect their leave? So, is flexibility and hybrid the answer here, or should that 15 days be relooked
So I
at?
think to start off with, SA's leave is very low in comparison to the rest of the world. So I actually did my master's in human rights, and one of my subjects was women's rights. Our leave, whether it's sick, whether it's annual, is extremely low in comparison, and very, I would say, stringent in comparison to, let's say, Europe. Um, so I think the amount, yes, and I think that is definitely something I'm seeing with that staff, when they're in the position to negotiate or move, or often move simply for more leave. So leave
Mm.
is now the new I'm not sure if it's the word commodity, but
Yeah, it
someone will
is.
definitely move, or um, and this is like the exciting, the past 2-3 years, I have had some companies who actually have created new sub type of leaves. So you still have your annual, but for instance, a family responsibility leave was increased to a larger amount, which because the whole maternity and has changed to shared parental leave, they've said they've increased that amount. Some companies have implemented self-care leave as well, which is
That's
interesting. So I think,
amazing.
yeah, so I think it's about looking at and once again being able to pull that data and see what is our absenteeism, what is our leave in any way. And what
Mm.
I've said to a lot of companies is that the definition of family responsibility leave is way too narrow in South Africa, firstly. It should have a much broader definition. Our cultural context, is much broader than that definition. Because at this moment, someone might be living with someone, and if that person passes away, they can't attend that person's funeral, which is absurd.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
a lot of companies are actually completely opening up the definition, saying, "Listen, employees, you have X amount per year. We trust you to use it wisely. You don't have to submit the doctor's note or the, death certificate, for example. Use it. If it's finished, it's finished in that way, and then you would need to go into annual. But yeah, I would say it's definitely re-looking the different type of leaves and not just sticking to what the act prescribes. You can be very creative.
That makes so much sense. And it's so encouraging to hear that companies are looking into it, because
Yeah.
I feel like when you look at what's on paper, sometimes it expects us to not have a life outside of the office at all. So, Silke, here's another one, and it's probably another impossible question to answer. Employees perform equally well, but one requires flexibility due to family responsibility. How do you ensure that they are treated equally or fairly in the hiring, promotions, and career opportunities, especially if there's still an underlying assumption that mothers are too unavailable? Like
Mm.
when you're sitting with those two CVs, or it's people you've been working with and you know them well, and you know both of them are great for this promotion. How do companies do this in a fair way?
Yo, it's a difficult one because I think in reality, I don't think it comes to play so much in the hiring, but it does very much happen in promotions. Once there are two employees, who and companies to decide which one is promoted. Obviously, companies would create like criteria as to what they're measuring that performance or promotion against. So I think um, probably the most fairest way where I see companies making or looking at that aspect the most is when it's more a company who does things informally. So the CEO goes on a aspect. They don't have performance reviews. They don't have KPIs. They don't have a platform that's tracking this. It's a feeling of it's very subjective. Then 100% that kind of weighs more like the one. And it's in the back of their mind. They sometimes don't even realize it themselves when they're making the decision. Where I feel if you have a strong HR department that's actually created all of these platforms and processes that I've said, and the HR is able to say, you've got these two, but you know, whether you know, in terms of performance, it's the same, or whether or not this one has a flexible day, she's actually more productive, or he is. So I think it's very often where it's more of an informal approach to HR, then the subjectivity creeps in a bit more.
Yeah, that's that's such a hard thing to face. I think so many people feel like they're in a dead end because they have kids. I've even
Mm.
heard moms saying they were chatting about a sibling who never had kids or are not going to go that route, and she's like, "Oh, she was the clever one. She never had kids." And I
Yes.
feel that just breaks my heart, because no mom should feel like that because she chose to have kids. She shouldn't feel like her sibling is treated in a different way just because she chose to be a mother. Like, have regrets, professional regrets, because of her children.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, it happens so often. It really does. And I think, yeah, like I said, I think the this where that happens the most is where there's just too much decision making lies with, sometimes even the person who's making the decision is removed from, isn't actually even the person that's managed these two employees. It's actually the
Mm.
incorrect person deciding on the promotion. And that subjectivity, it's like a feeling of this person is very hardworking. But I think it comes back to the culture of the company. If it is a culture of, let's see who can stay at the office as many hours as possible, well, the person who doesn't have children is going to get it just because of the culture. But if it's a culture of, I don't care what you are, what you're doing, are you performing or not, then the chances of that playing a role is less. So I think culture, um, yeah, plays a huge, 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 and just the openness of the top management, um, being open to change and changing things.
Okay. So I want to steer our conversation back to something more positive. um, so, for a mom who wants to have an open conversation with her HR manager or her company, what is the best approach to have, or to open the conversation with the people in charge? Like, where does she start?
Um, with regards to something specific, so let's say holiday planning.
Yeah, like, I feel like so many people maybe view HR as the enemy, and I don't think that's the right way to approach it. Like, what is the right approach to have conversations for change?
So I think you should be, like, HR should be someone who you are willing to approach, right? I always say to employees, don't put something on WhatsApp or email. Go to the HR person and talk in person, because you can verbalize much better what you're trying to say. So it should be a safe space. I've had, we staff, listen, super interesting stuff, and it should be, we're like, hey Zilke, I've had this idea, um and I think, these some feelings about a certain aspect. Can you maybe do a employee survey that's anonymous, so you provide tools or um aspects where staff can feel safe to actually say what they want to say? Because I think that's what the most employees are scared of, is that retaliation of, hey, I've said something and now um I'm going to be victimized in a way. So I think the HR should be the one to say, okay, this is maybe, so let's say workforce planning during school holidays. That's something that 3 people are really passionate about. Let's do a survey. Let's find out how many people, um, value this. And then how do we have the tools to make that a reality? Um, but I think, yeah, just first addressing stuff in person. And I think where things go wrong is when you receive this long email, and the tone and everything is wrong. Where if it is, hey, we want to improve um, things at the company, then I think the HR's approach is always like, awesome, like, tell me how we can improve. And I think in the ideal world, like HR should also be more proactive in a sense. You should be wanting feedback from employees. You should be wanting to, like I said, ask, what do you see as a benefit, and not just keep on giving the same benefits for 20 years because you think that's what staff want.
Because I think the traditional benefits were
Mm.
all thought out before there were so many women in the workforce. Like
Yes.
they all, like pension and medical aid, and those, like I said, traditional ones are all stuff that men want. Or
Yes.
50 years ago, the stuff
Ye-
men needed because
Yeah.
they had the support at home.
Yes.
But it's time to rethink and unlearn a lot of those old-fashioned ways of doing it.
Yeah. And I think also, like, obviously you need to have a guideline for benefits and you can't have it different for each person. But I do think I've had big companies say, listen, if my home situation is we've already got medical aid, I don't want medical aid, but
Yeah.
actually additional 5,000 rand um because I pay the school fees will go a long way. But now you're forced into taking that medical because or a double pension. So I think that's where staff really feel appreciated. If it's not just this is how it's going to be and it's always going to be like
Mm.
this. And very often what happens is a really valuable staff member will move to a different company or resign, and then HR will say, "Well, why?" And then they'll say, "Well, I'm getting 22 days instead of 15." You know. Um, so I think it's just being proactive and not waiting until exit interview phase um, before trying to keep someone. Um,
Yeah.
is
That
like
makes so much sense.
and surveys, right? Like employee surveys is so valuable. Once again, you can actually pull that data and see.
So, last question. For moms listening, what hope can you honestly offer them about the future of work?
I think I'm actually really excited more than I ever have been about the future of work, especially in South Africa. I think pre-COVID, um, I think we were very behind in the sense of, flexibility, hybrid. I think in South Africa, I think what I'm seeing is a lot of international companies are actually moving offices or are starting offices in South Africa, which kind of has in certain markets forced local companies to be more forward thinking because they're bringing in a lot like a larger or a much broader, more forward-thinking policies and benefits. So local companies are having to compete more with that, or companies that
Catch up.
yes. So I definitely think there's a huge drive in terms of measuring performance instead of just time, more than it's ever been. Yeah, like I think also, when interviewing, like make it I love it when candidates are very honest and especially as a mom to say, listen, I do have two children. You know, I ideally would like to work 2 days a week from home and 3 days in the office. Is that a possibility? Because often the client is willing to say yes, let's do that. But if the person's too shy to ask in the interview and to say like how they feel, you're not going to get it. So I think women in general just have to speak up more and ask because um with regards to everything, like yeah, don't not ask because then you don't know whether you would have been able. And if a company looks negatively on you for wanting flexibility, it's not the right company for you. I can promise you. Because if they're not open to that and that is something you feel passionate, there's not going to be a connection with multiple other stuff.
Yeah,
So yeah,
that makes so much sense.
yeah. Just be upfront.
Silke, thank you so, so much for joining me today. I feel like our conversation was so meaningful and hopeful and encouraging. And although in South Africa and many other places in the world, we still have a long way to go, there are definitely little rays of sun coming through the clouds that give all of us hope.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you, Madge. It's always a pleasure and yeah, spending time with you and love having these conversations.
Although the changes we discussed are not universal yet, or the fact that change is slow, it's still happening and there is hope. Take Silke's advice and speak to your HR manager about what you need. Open conversations can make a big difference. If this episode resonated with you, share it with another mom who needs to hear it. And if you're in a leadership or HR position, maybe it's the nudge to examine the gap between policy and culture. Because the reality is that when mothers are supported properly, organizations don't lose productivity. They gain loyalty, resilience, and efficiency. And that's just smart business. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time.